Hello and welcome back to my channel. Don't forget to subscribe because you will find my videos intriguing. Like and share your thoughts on this video. Topics about slavery and black history are very sensitive topics. More reason they're bent on removing the teachings and learning of black history in American schools because they always try to hide the traumatic actions or things they did to black people. Mostly the education around the entire topic and history of slavery, especially for white Americans, is so flawed. In this video, a pan-color American man shares how he has learned so much when it comes to history and the topic of slavery from just following black creators on TikTok. Now, he states that what he's been learning is more than what he's ever learned in schools. Looking at the type of conversations he had with his parents concerning this topic, he wonders how black parents have this conversation about slavery with their children. Here's the video. I will be right back.
So I just finished watching this video of this woman making food for Thanksgiving, and she was talking about the history of black Americans and Thanksgiving. And she was talking about how Thanksgiving was one of the first holidays that people who were enslaved were allowed to celebrate. And like many Americans, specifically white Americans who learned about slavery, I'm realizing that my education around the entire topic and history is so skewed and flawed. And the amount of things that I've learned just by following black creators on TikTok is more than I've ever learned in school. So then I started thinking about the conversations that I had with my parents about slavery when I started learning about it in school. And then it got me thinking, how do black parents have the conversation about slavery with their children? Is it a conversation that's like you sit down and you lay everything out? Is it like something that you slowly reveal more information about because it's obviously a very traumatic topic? Or for anybody out there, was it something that your parents even talked to you about? Or was it something that was like, oh, learned it in school? This is a 100% genuine question, and I just want to learn the differences of how black families teach about slavery versus white families.
Now, talking about history of slavery might seem like a hard topic to explain, especially to young children. However, with an age-appropriate discussion of the subject, students begin interrogating oppression and are reminded of the power of change. When such questions start coming up, it's important as parents to do your best to offer an accurate summation of slavery's injustice and a lasting impact. Check out these videos. I will be right back, and when I do, we get to talk more about this topic.
Is it a
This is a conversation that we often call the talk. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a very black neighborhood, go to a black church, and attend a mostly black elementary school. Slavery wasn't a topic that we didn't broach or that we didn't talk about. We also didn't feel this weird sense of shame that I know some people in our community feel. The way I was taught is that slavery was something that was done to us, but not something that defines us. I was more so taught that this was the history of white people, not the history of black people. Because I was surrounded by so many black voices, especially early on, there was never a sense of shame put into me about this thing that happened to us. If anything, it shows the initial point of our struggle with this country for our civil rights, our human rights. It shows the endurance and the power and the strength of black people. It is a difficult conversation. It almost feels like you're taking away your kid's innocence in a way. As a new parent, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to have this conversation. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Children.
So in our house, we talked about it slowly, kind of a build to this history. In a lot of households, I think we are trying to emotionally protect our children because we know the world will not protect them when it comes time to have these conversations in school. If you are the lone black kid, when the topic comes up in a classroom, everyone turns to look at you. If you have the wrong kind of history teacher, they're going to try and argue with you that slavery wasn't that bad. And because I have a degree in history and my husband and I both come from families where the person who was enslaved was our grandparents' grandparent, or in one case, grandparents' parent, we are having the kind of conversations you have where slavery is not abstract. Slavery is a very real part of family history. But we also had to prepare our kids for the reality that in school, depending upon teacher, classroom, all of these things, they might hear some things that they would know were not necessarily accurate. And they would need to be able to disagree respectfully. It was not a comfortable experience, right? It was not terrible. My kids were raised in Chicago. They went to schools that were predominantly black, so it was easier. But I definitely know people who went to majority white schools who had teachers that were very slavery denialists, shall we say. That's why we have those news stories, it seems like every year, where someone decides to hold a fake slave auction or decides to have children write about the economic benefits of slavery, it's not by accident. It is a way of undermining the truth of America's history. So you have to build in the wall against the lie, if that makes sense. Hope that answered your question.
Hello, I'm a Black parent of 3 kids, and I've got this 2 different ways, my parents telling me and then me telling my kids. So me growing up, I have 2 Black parents, and it was always a open conversation. Like, I knew when I was maybe like 4 or 5 that my grandmother's grandmother was born a slave. So our family history was always just part of our normal learning about family conversation. The greater conversation though in this is racism, because under the bigger umbrella of racism, you have like American slavery and all of this and that and the other. So my kids do not have 2 Black parents. Their dad is white. But I've always made it a point to emphasize to them that they are Black, we are Black, this is what our history is, this is who we are, this is where we come from. But up until recently, my children were raised in predominantly white areas. We just moved from Australia and we moved to Alabama, USA. So my kids now go to all Black schools. I mean, all staff, all students, all Black. So this has been a completely different experience for them, and they've brought home a lot of questions for me relating to race, because race is very big here in the South. I mean, obviously Alabama had more slaves than citizens at one point. And so I've been faced with some questions from my kids that I even had to sit and think about the answer to, because I was raised in a predominantly white area on the West Coast. So these are things that I didn't come across in school, things that I didn't experience in school. So moving here has been a cultural reset of sorts for my children and myself, explaining things that I'm like, oh, I've never even thought about that. Let me think about that and give you an answer. Some of the foods we traditionally cook and eat are, built from slavery. So that is just a part of our lives that's inextricably linked to being Black. It's the bigger conversation of racism and discrimination and privilege that I have found not challenging, but definitely a little more thought-provoking. And I'm sure it's going to be different amongst different families and depending on where you are regionally and your own personal histories, but that's how it is for my family.
Their children.
I also want to add, I said this already, but I also want to add that typically the conversation of slavery, in my experience, has been introduced 2 ways, either through modern day policing or through something they learned in school and then we had to talk about it. So the line from policing to slavery is direct. So parents have to have the tough conversations about police with their kids very early on, because we're targeted by the state. For instance, my son likes Paw Patrol. Paw Patrol is the police, baby. Paw Patrol is a part of the prison industrial complex, and media is a huge way of what shapes our thinking about these systems. I've also had full-blown conversations with my son about like how police are bad. They don't mean us well. And because we know the origins of policing, it's a through line to talking about slavery. And finally, I think this is why it's so important to have books and other media that is for all ages to introduce these topics in a way that doesn't censor whiteness. So it's me, y'all. I'm writing a book series called Abolitionist Adventures. And one of my first books is called Cops Are Ops. And I'm essentially going to break down tenets of abolition through the entry point of children's books. So join me on my journey next year, baby.
If you spend any time around kids, you know they're very inquisitive. They ask a lot of questions about any and everything. Why is the sky blue? How do they make planes fly? Where do babies come from? And one day, as a little Black child, you're going to ask a question and the answer is going to be racism. Have you ever asked somebody like a simple question and then they just start trauma dumping on you and you're like, damn, I was not expecting to hear all of that? I feel like that's how it goes when a lot of parents first try to explain slavery to their children. But it's not just like a sit down conversation like the talk about the birds and the bees, because the thing about being Black is that you don't have the privilege to ignore that identity. So as a parent raising Black children, there isn't just a conversation about slavery. Like, it's a lifetime of learning and education through all facets of life, because you got to raise your children not only to be upstanding citizens, but also to navigate a world that hates them for no reason besides the color of their skin. Also, I'm dead that we were all traumatized by watching Roots way too young, because same. My little brain could not comprehend everything that happened in that lengthy ass film.
Children.
I'm really happy we're having this conversation, and I want to chime in. Hi, my name is Robin, and I'm back to stir the pot with nuance. So I think for me personally, in my Black experience in my household, is that it started off really young. I'm trying to figure out how to say this. So like, I would say for me personally, it was my mom asking me how my day was at school and what did I learn at school today, and then we're going off of that. Or, you know, I'd come home and I'd ask my mom questions about like, you know, hey, we're learning XYZ in school today. Can you let me know like what's going on with that? And then we would have in-depth discussions. But like outside of a school context, it was deeply rooted at home. Like, it's watching Roots, it's watching Black movies, it's watching the news and having conversations about, hey, why are they doing XYZ to this Black person, XYZ? And I think the very first time I had the race conversation with my mom, I'm pretty sure I was in 6th grade. And the only reason we had this conversation was because that is when I had my first Black teacher, was in 6th grade. And her name was Miss Grimm, lovely Black lady with dreadlocks, loved her. But yeah, the whole question of like race and, you know, slavery and talking about being a Black American in our history, that kind of just gets incorporated throughout our childhood. And then we get to the certain point where we start to adventure out into the world on our own. And, you know, then parents will have the conversation of like, you know, what to do with police, how to act outside. But I think for a majority of Black parents, at least for like the older generation, it was just showing your kids Black media. Like Roots, The Wire, One-on-One, Brandy, Sister, Girlfriends. Like it was introducing us through Black media and then having the harder conversations later. At least that's my personal experience. But let me know how y'all Black families let y'all know about racism.
Slavery with their children.
No, I can't speak for everybody, but my family has never talked about slavery, and that we have never like talked about the enslavement of Black people in America specifically. But I will say that I learned about slavery through my family and also through my lived experience. What I mean by that is, for me, understanding why things work the way that they work, understanding why things are different than me than they were for my white peers, came with understanding slavery. For example, like in kindergarten, I did not go to daycare or pre-K. I was raised by my aunties, my mom, my grandma. I would always get dropped off at somebody's house instead of going to pre-K and daycare. And so when I went to kindergarten in a town that was 90% white. I go to kindergarten the first day, having never really talked to white people. And off the bat, they didn't understand me. One of the first things that I learned was how to code switch. And also I had to learn how to understand what language was appropriate here, what language was not. For example, like them not understanding what a whooping was, them not understanding what picking a switch was, them not understanding what I meant when I said rag, when I meant washcloth, things like that. It was understanding that certain language dates back to slavery and that they might not get it because they're not descendant of enslaved people.
I feel this is a good question, and the honest answer for me is that it is a slow burn, but we pretty much tell our kids from jump the truth of what's happened, but in terms of like the graphic details, the older they get, the more they can uncover and understand. And because WS is everything that we exist under, the air we breathe, everything else, we unpack it over the years and it gets more detailed, it gets more graphic. Now it also depends on where you are in your journey of decolonizing, and because I'm fully radicalized, not only do we unpack as it was then, but also how it impacts the Black community today. Now this question shows how both diverse and yet unifying the experience of being Black in America is. For some, the first time they learned about race and racism, by the extension slavery, was from their grandmothers. Now I have a friend who was telling me that this is how she learned about slavery, because her grandmother used to stay with them. So like when cooking or playing with them, she would talk about her childhood growing growing up in Florida, she would talk about how the central line in town would be the racial divider, that black people were on one side and palm color people were on the other. She said that this was as early as she could understand English, because she could just be around them and talk to them about her lived experiences. She would talk about the segregated water fountains, the segregated movie theaters, the segregated schools, and when she was a bit older, she would like ask her why this happened. And she would talk about how the country enslaved black people, that we fought a civil war, and when we couldn't justify enslaving them, we found different ways to subjugate them, one of which being Jim Crow segregation. Now, she would talk about marching, protesting, and striking. I also have another friend who was born in New York. He saw how he was perceived differently. His family and his siblings were racialized and treated differently just because they are black. Now, people asked him in school if he was busting from the inner city, and he was called the word in the 4th grade. So he would come home from school and ask about all these questions, and his parents would have to tell him. So around 5th and 6th grade, they had the talk that he was a big black boy, and you will be aged up and racialized by police and other authorities. He had to do genealogy projects in school, and people would ask him what country he's from, and he would go like, I don't know. So he ended up doing a lot more work to figure out his own family tree more than anyone else. Why was he doing genealogical research in 5th grade? Why was he storing public records, his grandmother's letters and diaries, to construct his family tree? Well, it is because enslavement and the Jim Crow South destroyed his family connection. Now, there's no uniform answer to when or how families talk about enslavement, race, and racism, but some common threads seem to be that you talk about race first because of the lived experience or your elders in your family, and then also applying that to what you're seeing in your own daily life, and then the questions that come back. There are really so many ways, but the way my mom or parents would talk or teach me about slavery would have to be in collaboration with school. So anytime there was like any kind of assignment to do, black history, blackness, race, slavery was a topic that I was going to do that report on. Now, when I saw this palm color man's video, I had to ask friends from different countries to just share their stories, and I had this Jamaican American who did several reports on the Jamaican Maroon when it comes to slavery. Now, the Maroons is an interesting topic when it comes to slavery in general. There are people that escaped slavery while slavery was happening. Usually they escaped to the hills or some sort of like treacherous place away from where the slavers could reach them and build their own independent lives. Sometimes it's like intermixed with indigenous people and all of that, but essentially they were free black people who got their freedom directly from escaping slavery. Now, the Maroons is such an interesting point to teach your child about slavery, and she thinks about why her mom did that, but now she knows that it was because her mom wanted her to research on her own with her guidance about parts of her existence in history and stuff like that. We have come to the end of the video, so feel free to share your own stories on how you learned about slavery or how you tackle this conversation with your kids. How do you tell them about slavery? Thank you for watching, and see you in my next video.